The story begins with a moment so surreal it feels lifted from a war zone rather than an ordinary street. A black woman with tight curly hair, wearing a faded military jacket and bearing dark skin, was simply exiting a veterans clinic when two uniformed white officers stepped from their patrol car, blocked her path, and ordered her to kneel. Before she could even kneel, one of the officers drew a service pistol, pressed it against her abdomen, and squeezed the trigger without so much as a second thought. As the bullet pierced her body, blood spattered across the stars and stripes patch on her sleeve. The officer murmured almost indifferently, "Target neutralized," then turned and walked away, as if he had merely completed a routine task. Sorry to interrupt the story. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. What those officers did not know was that this was no ordinary passerby. She was a retired NATO tactical commander, an Omega-level operative whose very existence had been classified at the highest levels. The instant the shot was fired, hidden satellite relays lit up across secure military networks, alerting command to a breach in protocol and the unauthorized engagement of one of their own. In that single terrible heartbeat, everything changed. A simple afternoon errand became the spark for an international incident, setting in motion covert alarms and secret procedures designed to protect assets deemed untouchable. No one witnessing that scene on the sidewalk could have guessed the depth of her experience or the gravity of what had just occurred, but the hidden world she inhabited moved immediately into action. And so the quiet sunlit parking lot outside the clinic transformed within seconds into the epicenter of a crisis that would shake both military and civilian authorities to their core. Less than a minute later, Sergeant Xavier Reed, an honorably discharged veteran of SEAL Team 6, stepped out of the clinic, gently guiding his 6-year-old daughter by the hand. His uniform was spotless boots, shined the familiar American flag patch sewn on his sleeve. In one hand, he held his daughter's juice box, in the other, her stuffed bear. He had just finished a routine follow-up appointment and was walking her to the car when a patrol cruiser screeched to a halt, tires squealing against the pavement. Two white officers emerged, their movements stiff and purposeful. One wore mirrored aviator sunglasses, the other rested a hand on his holstered sidearm. Before Xavier could even ask what the problem was, the sunglasses-clad officer barked, "What branch are you from, Xavier?" Paused, heart tightening, and replied in a measured voice, "Sergeant U.S. Army, retired SEAL Team 6. The second officer sneered, "I don't buy it. That uniform looks stage patches too clean." "Where'd you get it?" Elijah instinctively positioned himself between his daughter and the officers. "From the United States government," he said calmly. "I've just come from the clinic. You may ask the front desk." The first officer stepped closer. "You'll verify it another way," he growled. "Kneel, hands on your head." Cradling his daughter, Xavier's voice remained steady but firm. "I'm sorry, officer, I can't kneel while holding my child. There's no probable cause." The second officer barked back, "You're impersonating a federal officer. That's a felony. Kneel now or we'll make you." His daughter's small voice trembled. "Daddy, what's happening?" Xavier's heart broke, but he didn't waver. "I'm not a threat," he replied softly, tucking her closer. Unarmed and unthreatening, Xavier stood rooted to the spot, a silent testament to the truth that uniforms and valor do not guarantee respect or safety once prejudice enters the room. Amid the mounting tension, Xavier gently shifted his daughter behind him and reached into his jacket for identification. He unzipped the inner pocket, his uniform crisp against his veteran's body, and offered his wallet to the officers. The little girl, panic still flickering in her wide eyes, surprised everyone when she slipped her hand into her dress pocket and produced a tarnished metal badge, her grandfather's old certifying pin dulled by years of wear. She held it up with trembling fingers, whispering, "This was his." He said only a real soldier could carry it. Officer Ryan snorted in disdain. "A toy badge," he spat, leaning in so close Xavier could feel the officer's breath. "That proves nothing. You're still out of line." His partner stood silent but ready, fingers flexing against his holster. Elijah continued to offer his official ID, remaining calm despite his daughter's small body shaking against his hip. "Please, officer, see the paperwork in my wallet. I'm retired U.S. Navy SEAL, Sergeant SEAL Team 6. He spoke quietly but with unshakable certainty. Ryan's jaw twitched. "You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer," he barked, voice rising. Comply or face felony charges. At that moment, a passerby, a man in his 40s, pulled out his smartphone and began filming. His voice cut through the standoff. What are you doing to him? He's in uniform right in front of a federal building. Back off, Ryan snapped at the man, but the bystander held his ground. You're harassing a veteran, he insisted. Let him show his ID. Smoke of disbelief filled the air. In that charged silence, the clinic parking lot became a courtroom of conscience. Xavier's daughter clutched her grandfather's badge to her chest, and the man once hailed for valor on distant battlefields stood accused on his home turf. The smartphone's lens recorded every flicker of prejudice and every stubborn heartbeat of dignity, and in that recording lay the seeds of accountability. Officer Mayan's patience snapped. Kneel now, he snarled, raising his voice over the mounting protests. Xavier's daughter whimpered, clutching her grandfather's badge as she pressed closer to her father's side. Xavier only shook his head, steeling himself to shield his child. Before anyone could intervene, Ryan fired a single echoing shot. In an instant, the mother collapsed forward, the crimson stain spreading across the American flag patch on her worn jacket. Yet even as her knees buckled, she cradled the little girl tighter, folding her body around the child in a final act of protection. The girl's tiny voice broke the stunned silence. Uncle D, they shot Mommy. Every second after the shot became protocol in motion. Hidden sensors triggered the Falcon 51 asset alert, an Omega-level breach through civilian channels, and transmitted it directly to Fort Cedar Falls. Within moments, Fort Cedar Falls elevated its status to Alpha Alert, invoking the highest domestic response protocols. Military channels bypassed civilian frequencies. Police radios fell silent under interference. The parking lot, once sunlit and ordinary, transformed into the epicenter of a national crisis. By the time the next patrol car arrived, local law enforcement found their systems overridden and their authority eclipsed by a military response that answered only to a classified chain of command. Watching from a distance, civilians held their breath. A single shot had shattered both a life and the illusion of civilian supremacy. The tragedy played out in hushed awe, a decorated operative now fallen her final act, one of selfless love. And high above, unseen but unmistakable, the machinery of war had roared into gear, because some boundaries exist not just to be tested, but to be defended at any cost. At Fort Cedar Falls, there was no pause or question. The order was already in effect. Military command channels seized control of all civilian frequencies. Security cameras in the clinic's vicinity went dark as if wiped from existence. Local police radios sputtered into static, their familiar chatter replaced by silence. In that void, a small platoon of special operations soldiers materialized like ghost black-clad figures moving with deliberate precision. They skirted the stunned officers and bewildered onlookers, their boots silent against the pavement. Without a word or a glance at anyone else, they formed a tight circle around the fallen colonel's body, gently lifting her into a stretcher. One soldier knelt beside her daughter, offering a steady hand, and together they escorted the small girl away from the scene and into the waiting unmarked vehicle. No sirens announced their arrival. No voice explained their actions. They simply carried out their task and vanished again into the undercurrent of military order. For the officers who had drawn their weapons mere moments before, and the civilians who had crowded around with phones raised the swoop, felt like the shift of an invisible tide. One minute their radios had crackled with commands. The next minute they were reading only white noise. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath as those soldiers slipped into the shadows, leaving behind the quiet resonance of authority, truly known only in its absence. In the stunned hush that followed, neither word nor question pierced the air. The only sound was the soft closing of the unmarked vehicle's door, and in that gentle click, Fort Cedar Falls' message rang clear. Some lines of command are drawn so deeply that when crossed, they invoke a response beyond explanation, an unspoken promise that no one, however high or low, is ever truly beyond its reach. The bystander's smartphone video went live before the dust had settled, and within minutes it was everywhere. There was no need for commentary, just the stark image of the fallen colonel cradling her child as blood spattered across the stars and stripes on her shoulder. That single frame, frozen in time, carried more weight than any reporter's voice. On Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, the clip racked up views in the millions. Veterans forums lit up with shock and outrage, with former service members exchanging messages of disbelief. How could this happen on home soil? Where is the accountability? Within hours, Stand with Falcon 51 and Raw Final Shot trended nationwide. People shared the video with captions like, "This is our uniform. This is our sacrifice, and justice delayed is justice denied." In living rooms across the country, families watched in stunning silence. Grandparents remembering their own brothers and sisters in uniform shook their heads in dismay. Young soldiers on leave sent the link to their units, urging comrades to see what we stand for and what we stand against. Local news stations cut into evening broadcasts to replay the footage, each anchor's voice tinged with disbelief as they recounted the basic facts without adding spin. Editorial boards demanded inquiries. Clergy delivered impassioned sermons on the sanctity of life and the duty owed to those who served. By dawn the next day, communities organized candlelight vigils outside VA clinics, police precincts, and town squares. People held homemade signs, some simple reading, "Honor our heroes." Others more pointed, "Don't shoot the shield." Politicians feeling the heat issued statements of concern, and law enforcement agencies scrambled to explain. But even as the official spin began, the video remained unfiltered. Each replay reinforced the truth: a decorated operative shot in broad daylight, her uniform stained with her own blood, her child left clinging to her side. No amount of talking points could erase the image. It stood as a solemn demand for transparency and justice carried on the digital winds to every corner of the nation. 2 days after the video went viral, the Department of Defense broke its silence. In a terse public statement, the Pentagon confirmed that Falcon 51 was indeed an active duty service member and that any use of force against her would be prosecuted under Article 49C of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That single declaration sent shockwaves from the Judge Advocate General's Corps all the way to the halls of Congress. Almost immediately, congressional committees and military oversight panels scrambled to convene emergency hearings. Lawmakers questioned senior defense officials about the chain of command, the rules of engagement on American soil, and how a uniformed operative could be so tragically misidentified. Witnesses included top generals, JAG officers, and civilian legal experts, all pressed to explain the overlap and sometimes the collision between military authority and civilian policing. Meanwhile, local police departments found themselves under intense scrutiny. The same officers who had once waved away concerns about uniform authenticity were now ordered to hand over every report, every radio transcript, and every body camera clip related to the incident. Chiefs of police, once dismissive of military credentials without ID cards, now watched as their precincts became case studies in failed interagency cooperation. Federal investigators arrived to review standard operating procedures and to issue binding directives for future joint operations. For the ordinary citizen, these high-level hearings felt like history unfolding. Cameras lined the hearing rooms, and TV networks interrupted regular programming to carry a live testimony. Families of veterans tuned in, many with tears in their eyes, recalling their own service or the sacrifices of loved ones. Community leaders and advocacy groups seized on the moment to demand lasting reforms, urgent legislation, mandatory training on recognizing military insignia, and clear protocols for how law enforcement must respond when encountering uniformed personnel. In just 48 hours, what began as a parking lot tragedy had become a national reckoning. The message was unmistakable: when the uniform of our armed forces is disregarded, everyone pays the price, and no institution, military or civilian, can remain above accountability. Across the nation, law enforcement agencies moved swiftly to reform every aspect of their interaction with uniformed service members. Police academies introduced dedicated modules on identifying Omega-level assets, ensuring officers nationwide could distinguish active duty and retired personnel from imposters. Civilian complaint procedures were overhauled. An independent review board now oversaw every allegation of misconduct with full public disclosure of findings. Every precinct installed or reactivated security cameras, both inside stations and on patrol vehicles, so no encounter could slip through the cracks again. In one major metropolitan department, the police chief was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Joint task forces with the military were suspended indefinitely, giving both sides time to revise standard operating procedures. Gone were casual handshakes between local cops and base commanders. In their place stood formal memoranda of understanding that spelled out roles, responsibilities, and channels of communication. Meanwhile, the protests that had begun online found a new, quieter form in the streets. Veteran students, teachers, and even elected officials stood in solemn silence outside courthouses and police stations. They did not shout slogans or wave signs, but formed unbroken lines, rank after rank of still figures bearing witness to a broken promise. Their silence spoke volumes, marking the moment when public outrage matured into deliberate, unyielding resolve. What had started as a single tragic shooting had become the catalyst for a wholesale recalibration of the civilian-military relationship. No longer merely a viral sensation, the story of that courageous officer willing to protect her child at the cost of her own life had forced institutions to look inward. From Washington to small towns, the ripples of change could be felt in policy revisions, in classroom lessons on civic duty, and in renewed commitments by community leaders. In its wake, the parking lot incident refused to be forgotten. It did not fade as a distant news item, but became the benchmark against which every future interaction between police and service members would be measured. Because sometimes a single act of courage and the collective silence that followed can achieve what 1,000 speeches never could. 1 month later, behind locked doors at the Pentagon, the nation's highest-ranking leaders convened an unprecedented summit. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the chair of the Homeland Security Committee sat together around a mahogany table, each fully briefed on the fallout from the VA clinic shooting. With solemn faces, they signed and sealed the Restorat Directive, a strategic reconciliation order that went far beyond mere policy tweaks. Restorat mandated a top-to-bottom review of every reported use of force by civilian officers against uniformed service members past and present. It established an interagency commission vested with full access to classified military records, police internal affairs files, and all related evidence, no exceptions. This panel would be empowered to recommend disciplinary or legal action for misconduct rather than merely rubber-stamp local investigations. In the weeks ahead, Restorat's ripple effects reshaped both military and civilian institutions. Joint training exercises were redesigned to include mandatory briefings on the legal status of Omega-level assets, and civilian law enforcement officers received refresher courses on recognizing valid military credentials under domestic rules of engagement. Meanwhile, military commanders were tasked with reporting every off-base incident involving local police, ensuring immediate escalation when service member safety was at risk. Beyond procedural changes, Restorat carried a symbolic weight. It represented a formal reset of the social compact between those in uniform and the communities they protect. By cutting then rebuilding the framework of cooperation, leaders acknowledged that historic gaps in mutual understanding could no longer stand. This wasn't reform for its own sake. It was a reconstruction of trust, built on transparency and shared accountability. For veterans' families, for local police chiefs, and for everyday citizens, Restorat confirmed that no one wearing the flag on their sleeve would ever again be left unprotected or unrecognized. In its first month alone, the Commission reviewed dozens of cases, issued public reports, and recommended new guidelines that were already saving lives. In the end, Restorat was more than an order. It was a promise solemnly sworn at the highest level that the bond between civilian law enforcement and the armed forces would be restored and fortified for generations to come. 6 months on, the echo of that shooting still resonates across the nation. Falcon 51 has become more than a code name. It is now a lasting monument in paint and stone. Murals depicting the fallen colonel and her child grace city walls from coast to coast. Banners fly outside courthouses and VA clinics, each bearing the simple silhouette of her uniform and the date she gave her life. Security checkpoints at federal buildings display framed photographs of her final moments, reminding every guard that a uniform demands respect. At the United States Military Academy, plebes in their first weeks watch the grainy footage of the shooting as part of their ethics curriculum. In small seminar rooms, gray-haired officers and young cadets debate the meaning of duty accountability and the price of silence. We study her courage, when an instructor tells them, and our failures. Her daughter, now a teenager, carries her mother's legacy into every drill and ceremony. Accepted into the academy herself, she wears her mother's name as her middle name, an unspoken vow that she will never allow her story to be forgotten. Fellow cadets salute her as she passes, aware that her presence embodies both tragedy and the imperative for change. But there is no grand verdict hanging over these scenes, no final court judgment to close the book. Instead, there is a living, breathing system that has learned to listen. Police departments nationwide still review every use of force policy through the lens of Falcon 51. Military and civilian leaders hold joint panels on communication and respect. Training manuals quote her last act of protection as the highest standard of service. In the quiet aftermath, justice has become more than a word. It is a practice of constant vigilance, a commitment that every uniformed individual will be seen, heard, and valued. From the stillness of that parking lot to the halls of West Point, the story of Falcon 51 endures not as a chapter closed, but as an ongoing call to ensure that silence, when broken for truth, leads to lasting, tangible change. A few years later, the legacy of Falcon 51 has woven itself into the very fabric of military and civilian life. In city centers, what began as solemn murals have given way to living memorials. Small parks adorned with plaques recounting her story, benches engraved with her daughter's name, and the words "honor in silence." Outside VA clinics, volunteers offer free legal advisement to veterans, a direct outgrowth of the reform she inspired. Within the Defense Department, a dedicated operational civics office trains every incoming officer, whether military, federal agent, or local lawman, in the principles first laid down by the Falcon 51 Commission: respect for uniformed service, empathy for those in crisis, and the unwavering duty to verify before acting. In police academies, recruits drill not only in tactics, but also in protocol panels that revisit the Omega-level asset guidelines. Those sessions always open with the same advice: remember the stillness before the shot. At the military academy, the former colonel's daughter now lectures underclassmen in history classes, explaining how a single act of violence and the silence that followed it prompted change that no courtroom verdict ever could. She wears her mother's badge in her dress blues and speaks of duty as something earned daily, not merely listed on paperwork. On the anniversary of that fateful day, tens of thousands gather across the country: veterans, students, teachers, first responders, in quiet assemblies. No speeches, no banners, just a minute of silence held at exactly the same hour she fell. Phones are turned off, breath is held, and when the minute ends, they disperse without fanfare, their presence a living testament that justice endures in every person who learns to listen before they act. What began as tragedy has matured into a culture of vigilance and compassion. The country learned the hard way that uniforms are more than fabrics and badges more than symbols. They are bonds of trust to be honored with every step and every breath. And in that hard-earned understanding, Falcon 51's true victory endures quiet, unbreakable, and forever part of who we are. Through this story, we realize that courage need not be expressed in shouts. Sometimes it is the steadfastness found in silence. The message is each of us has the right to shape a more just future. Now I want to hear your perspective. What resonated most profoundly with you in this narrative? Do you believe racism will end in 10, 20, or 30 years, or that it may never fully disappear? Please leave a comment with your prediction and share what actions you think are crucial to accelerate change. Your voice, however small, can resonate and help spark a wave of reform, guiding our community toward a society where equality is no longer a distant ideal.